All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Valeri, and as the Vice Director of the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics here at WashU, I welcome you to this afternoon talk and discussion with Jillian Snyder. Jillian Snyder is the Assistant Director of the Glenn Family Honors Program and an Assistant Teaching Professor at the University of Notre Dame. Prior to joining the Glenn Honors Program, Professor Snyder taught at Christ College, Valparaiso University's honors program. A literary historian with a focus on religion and literature, she received her PhD from the University of Notre Dame, where she worked on early modern drama and Reformation literature. Her current book project, Sincere Performances, Scripting the Body in Post-Reformation England, examines how preachers and players in Shakespeare's England grappled with the lived bodily experience of Protestant reform. She also writes, as we will soon hear, I think, on the reception of Shakespeare in American religious communities from the 19th through the 21st centuries, exploring how these communities find in Shakespeare a source of cultural capital. Her research has been funded by Notre Dame's Presidential Fellowship, the Mellon Foundation, the American Friends of the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. So please join me in welcoming to Washington University, Jillian Snyder.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you so much to the Danforth Center for welcoming me out in a much warmer atmosphere than South Bend, Indiana. I am so thrilled that it's 55 outside, and I'm thrilled to be joining you here today to talk to you a little bit about my research. As Mark said, I'm an early modernist, but I also am deeply interested in Shakespeare in 20th and 21st century American thought. Today I'll be talking a little bit about the 19th century, a little bit about the 20th century, and I think we're going to have a lot of fun this afternoon. So we'll even watch some Shakespeare. And for those of you that are feeling a little intimidated by watching some Shakespeare, I'll give you the Cliff Notes. All right. So my talk today is called The Bible and the Bard, How Secular Protestants Made Shakespeare into Secular Scripture. Let me just get this started. A few years ago, a visitor walking through the administrative building of Bob Jones University, a bastion of fundamentalist Protestantism in Greenville, South Carolina, would have encountered a surprising sight. Hanging on the wall for decades was a massive oil painting of the school's second president, Bob Jones Jr. But Jones Jr. wasn't depicted behind a pulpit or holding a Bible. He was in full costume as Shylock, the complicated villain from Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice. This depiction is surprising, not simply because of the subject. If you know anything about Bob Jones University, you know it's a haven for cultural separatism. Even today, the university outlaws everything from jazz to dancing to magazines to PG-13 films. Students who want to go off campus to see a concert or a theater performance need to first get permission from the School of Fine Arts. And that's not all. The university fought interracial dating all the way to the Supreme Court, who ruled in 1983 that the university would lose its tax-exempt status, even if their convictions were religiously based, which they argued they were. It wasn't until the year 2000, after a visit from then-President George W. Bush, that the school finally lifted the ban. So what is the world's most unusual university, as they've called themselves, doing with a shrine to Shakespeare? That's the subject of my talk today. I'm going to explore how Bob Jones University drew upon a vision of Shakespeare that has been long forgotten to us, but that was very much within Anglo-American Protestantism at the turn of the 20th century. For Protestants, Shakespeare was a moral guide, a figure whose knowledge of human nature, as set out in his plays, could contribute to a person's spiritual development. Moreover, Shakespeare's works were held in such high esteem that they were placed alongside and sometimes even rivaled the King James Bible, which is still the preferred translation at Bob Jones. I'll tell this story today in 3 acts. I call Act 1 American Bardolatry, Shakespeare in the 19th century Protestant imagination, which outlines Shakespeare's presence long before the founding of Bob Jones. In Act 2, From Page to Platform, I'll talk about how conservative Protestants, who up to this point largely rejected theater-going, became a captive audience to Shakespearean drama. And in Act 3, The World's Most Unusual University, I'll trace the controversial history of Bob Jones University's Shakespeare program. We'll also watch a few scenes from the school's first-length film, feature-length film, a production of Macbeth, to get a sense of how the school adapted Shakespeare to reflect their fundamentalist values. As we will see, the university used Shakespeare to engage with wider culture, even to evangelize, while nevertheless maintaining their separatist stance. Act 1, American Bardolatry. Long before Bob Jones was a household name in the United States, Shakespeare had become akin to a household god. From the 18th century onward, American colonists had been drawn to his works for moral lessons. Even in New England, still deep under the thrall of Puritan influence, Shakespeare's works appeared as part of a larger moral program. Othello, for example, was now reimagined as a lesson in virtue. One playbill didn't even list the tragedy's name, but instead called it a moral dialogue in 5 parts, depicting the evil effects of jealousy and other bad passions, and proving that happiness can only spring from the pursuit of virtue. During the Revolutionary War, Shakespeare was the only neutral party, and snippets from his plays appeared on both Patriot and Loyalist sides. Both parodied, for example, the well-known soliloquy from Hamlet, with one patriot asking, "Be taxed or not be taxed? That is the question." After the Revolution, the population moved west, and they took Shakespeare with them. As Alexis de Tocqueville remarked during his visit to the United States, "There is hardly a pioneer's hut that does not contain a few odd volumes of Shakespeare." Shakespeare's works appeared in homes across the nation that otherwise had little money or room for a library, and in this way, he became part of the national consciousness. But as readers imbibed him, they were not merely engaging in literary appreciation. Many were beginning to practice bardolatry. Take William Holmes McGuffey. McGuffey was a Presbyterian minister and the editor of the McGuffey's Readers, a textbook that taught millions of American children how to read in the 19th century. Snippets from Shakespeare's plays appeared throughout his texts, especially the second editions. McGuffey's advice? Read the Bible first, Shakespeare second. During the Civil War, the poet Oliver Wendell Holmes would praise Shakespeare's works as being akin to another Bible. He called Shakespeare, quote, "Earth's clearest mirror of the light above, plain as the record on a prophet's scroll." In Holmes's view, Shakespeare might as well have finished each play with a "Thus saith the Lord." Ralph Waldo Emerson referred to Shakespeare as, quote, "the prophet of the human race," unquote. Emerson would hold up Shakespeare alongside the faith, claiming that, quote, "There is, in all cultivated minds, a silent appreciation of Shakespeare's superlative power and beauty, which, like Christianity, qualifies the period," unquote. These opinions were so pervasive that Herman Melville, the author of Moby Dick, complained that Shakespeare had practically become an American superstition. Melville joked that, quote, "The 39 articles of the Anglican Church are now 40. You must believe in Shakespeare or quit the country." Other writers weren't simply talking about Shakespeare as a devotional object. They were actually placing his works into religious forms. In 1898, the novelist William Day Simons published Sermons from Shakespeare, in which you could draw lessons from noble Brutus, faithful Cordelia, faultless Desdemona, destiny-driven Hamlet, and Lady Macbeth. He didn't give her an adjective. In his introduction, Symonds explains that the sermons are not literary lectures, but exhortations to a moral life. He then asks his readers to meditate on Shakespeare himself, claiming, quote, "As devotees at other shrines find sweetness and light, so would we seek the soul of virtue." Symonds wasn't alone. In 1888, Gardner Quincy Colton published Shakespeare in the Bible, Parallel Passages. I find Colton to be a fascinating figure. So he's considered to be the pioneer of anesthesia because he was a showman who would give audience volunteers nitrous oxide to make them laugh or dance or fight on stage. Maybe we could do a demonstration at the end of the talk. Colton's book was part of a genre that would list biblical passages alongside their Shakespearean analogs. And within Shakespeare scholarship, we still have books like this today. But like Symonds' books, Colton's is devotional. His second chapter, titled Of Shakespeare's Religious Principles and Sentiments Derived from the Bible, he practically writes a systematic bardology. His headings begin with Of the Nature and Being of God, which you can see up here. And the section includes the names and attributes of God, such as Lord of Hosts, the King Immortal, and King of Kings. And underneath is a quote from Cardinal Beaufort and King Henry VI, using these terms. Colton would fittingly conclude this chapter with, of death and day of judgment. Now, in his conclusion, Colton uses an anecdote from his childhood in New England to explain the reason for writing the book. As he tells it, quote, "When I was a boy in the country, my good Orthodox minister father thought it very sinful to read a play of Shakespeare. Probably he never read a play himself and never dreamed that the same lessons he taught from the pulpit were produced in these plays, in which vice and virtue receive their proper reward. But I have heard that guilty creatures sitting at a play have, by the very cunning of the scene, been so struck to the soul that presently they have proclaimed their malefactions." These lines he quotes are from Hamlet's monologue on the power of the stage to reveal a person's evil deeds. And for Colton, they cut to the heart. Few sermons, he concludes, have been able to accomplish as much as this. Now, these forms of Shakespeare may seem surprising for us, and perhaps it's easy for us to dismiss them as just an affectation, a way of talking about the author as genius. But the literary critic Charles Laporte argues that we should take this phenomenon seriously, and I think he's right. As these texts show, for many 19th century Americans, Shakespeare's works would become a second Bible. Laporte calls this a secular Bible, a Bible of humanity, or a Bible of genius. Now, of course, these views were not shared by all Protestants. Revivalists like D.L. Moody would insist that the Bible was, in his words, far surpassing Shakespeare or any other human author. But for many, Shakespeare acted as a sort of Protestant Virgil who helped guide people through the dark woods of human nature. Act 2. Now, despite their devotion to Shakespeare, Anglo-American Protestants were not very interested in theater going. Protestants read Shakespeare, they recited Shakespeare, they studied Shakespeare, they memorized Shakespeare. But theater was still viewed as a den of iniquity. The historians Robert and Victoria Case put it this way. The word theater had most of the connotations of sin itself. Theater meant painted women and dissolute men. It meant cheap vaudeville and the can-can and Corin hussies who not only displayed brazen ankles, but brazen knees to the public gaze. It meant flesh and the devil. That's capital F, capital D. Methodists, Baptists, and Presbyterians alike railed against it. So how did it happen that by the early 20th century, Anglo-American Protestants were attending theater performance? The change partially came from another sort of performance, the Chautauqua movement of the late 19th century. For those of you who don't know it, Chautauqua was an adult summer program that focused on creating spiritual and educational programming for Protestants across denominational boundaries. The concept of it began at a camp meeting attended by Lewis Miller, an Ohio businessman and father-in-law of Thomas Edison. Reclining at the rear of the camp meeting, Miller felt slightly repulsed at its outbreaks of revivalist emotions. Turning to his female companions, he remarked, "Girls, why wouldn't it be a good idea to have a Sunday school camp meeting?" Miller brought his idea to the Methodist bishop John Hyle Vincent, and the two set out to make it a reality. They purchased a camp meeting site on Lake Chautauqua in western New York, where they built a lifelike replica of the Holy Land, and that summer welcomed 40 Sunday school teachers for 2 weeks. Their program quickly became popular and quickly expanded to include Bible studies, musical entertainment, dramatic recitations, and lectures. After constructing cabins, the site took on a life of its own. Here you can see on your left the Newton Hall, which is their Middle Eastern archaeology museum. Its cavernous inner courtyard, one scholar believes, was meant to resemble the British Museum. After a few years, thousands of lay people were attending the Chautauqua meetings, which had now stretched to 2 months. And by 1899, the movement had spread to 22 other former camp meeting sites, largely drawing white middle-class Protestants from across denominational boundaries. By the first decades of the 20th century, traveling Chautauquas would visit small towns across the nation, bringing with them lecturers, performers, and musicians. And at its peak, between 9 and 20 million American Protestants attended a Chautauqua. Key to the Chautauqua movement was its goal of cultural uplift, one in which faith meets Enlightenment education. And Shakespeare played a central role in this vision. As he describes the movement's history, Vincent rooted it in the larger educational aims of John Wesley, Methodism's founder. Denouncing his detractors who would like to separate the schoolhouse from God's house, Vincent would proclaim, "When I see John Wesley taking Shakespeare's plays and so selecting, abridging, and modifying that he could put them into the hands of young people for their culture, when I see what John Wesley did in promotion of secular culture among his people, that they might be broad as well as intense, I say again, away with the heresy that a man is stepping aside from his legitimate work as a Christian minister when he is trying to turn all secular nature into an altar for the glory of God." Now, we actually don't know if Wesley ever abridged Shakespeare. I have contacted several John Wesley scholars, and I have contacted the Wesley archives, and there's no record of this. So I don't know if Vincent was making it up. But it was Wesley's efforts to make writers like Shakespeare accessible to children that Vincent claims is his basis for Chautauqua. Vincent used Chautauqua to deepen Wesley's alleged trailblazing. The program hosted frequent lectures on Shakespeare, some by Protestant ministers. They also included Shakespeare's works in the Chautauqua reading circles, an adult education program. In the Chautauqua School of Theology, Shakespeare was listed alongside other authors as what Vincent would call the distinguished students of human nature, whose stories could warn ministers against the false philosophy of each age. But while Shakespeare was a frequent subject of Chautauqua's education efforts, there was still little appetite for the theatrical, revivalist, or otherwise. In fact, after they founded the New York Chautauqua, Miller and Vincent created a department of order to remove attendees who would interrupt the lectures to implore audiences to salvation or even shout the name of the Almighty. So when Chautauqua did welcome theater, it needed to be done in a way that aligned with its values. The solution came in the form of a Britishman, Sir Philip Barlington Greet, more simply called Ben. Ben Greet was an ideal figure to lead these first performances. He was both a Christian socialist, which was a very popular movement in the period, and a practicing member of the Church of England. He had what one scholar referred to as a quasi-religious vocation to bring theater to Christian audiences who had not experienced it before. He went so far as to contribute to a collection of essays published by the Church of England on the power of theater to enrich people's daily and spiritual lives. Greet's theatrical productions were also sensitive to the suspicions of American Protestant audiences. In 1902, he staged a performance of the medieval morality play Everyman in New York City. Greet was aware of his audience's hesitance towards displays of God the Father, so he actually altered the staging to conceal the character. The production was a resounding success. It went on national tour and provided Greet an opening for his next theatrical foray, Shakespeare. Greet's productions radically altered Shakespearean performance in the United States. Prior to Greet, performances were largely staged indoors, relying on elaborate sets and drastically cut scripts. Greet used sparse sets and deployed rapid-fire performances to maintain audience interest. During the summer, his players would perform outdoors. His company became known for, and some would say actually invented, open-air Shakespeare performance in the United States. Finally, Greet also strategically marketed his troupe. He branded his performances as authentically Elizabethan, using the motto, "Shakespeare's plays as Shakespeare wrote them." In the advertisement here, you can see Greet's players hovering around Shakespeare, who raises his hand as if to guide them through a scene. So let me show you how Greet changed the scene of Chautauqua by using a case study out of Winona Lake, Indiana, which is just down the road from where I teach. Founded by Presbyterians in 1881, Winona Lake was the site of a thriving Chautauqua. It attracted nearly 250,000 attendees at its peak. Its first theatrical productions were held in 1908, with Greet's Woodland Players performing 4 Shakespearean comedies, As You Like It, Twelfth Night, A Midsummer Night's Dream, and The Tempest. 1 year prior to their performance at Winona Lake, the players performed the same 4 comedies under the trees at Indianapolis's John Herron Art Institute. As the Indianapolis Star breathlessly recounted, this is the best theater review I've ever read. They read Shakespeare as if they loved him, and the kind breezes caught up the words and bore them over brown meadows and crimson woods as though they loved them too and were loath to let them go. May somebody write that about your work someday. Winona Lake eagerly welcomed Greet. Audiences were reported in the thousands. The Chautauqua organizers embraced Greet's marketing strategy, describing the players as, quote, master interpreters of Shakespearean plays with natural scene settings as the author and his players gave them back in the early English era. They invited him back the following year, setting his performance just after the Reverend H.H. Moninger's Bible Hour. Greet's players would perform at Winona Lake 3 times, and by 1930, the site sponsored at least 15 full Shakespearean productions. Greet then went on to tour the circuit Chautauquas, and by way of him, Anglo-American Protestants across the nation experienced and embraced Shakespearean theatrical performance. Change, however, was in the air. In 1894, Winona Lake would begin hosting another summer program, the Winona Lake Bible Conference. Described as a religious Chautauqua, the Bible Conference shared Miller and Vincent's vision of educating Sunday school teachers. But unlike Chautauqua, it focused on what its founder, Solomon Dickey, referred to as church problems. Now, this phrase euphemistically described a growing chasm within the Protestant faith. According to the historian George Marsden, up to this point, Americans had embraced what he called the old order of American Protestantism, which was based on the interrelationship of faith, science, the Bible, morality, and civilization. It was about to crumble. As Darwinian evolution, alongside developments in biblical interpretation, seeped into Protestant seminaries and institutions, attendees of the Bible Conference and Chautauqua alike raised the alarm about the threats to the Bible's primacy and authority. Reacting with doctrinal militancy, conservative Protestants fortified themselves against attacks on what they called the fundamentals of the faith. The Winona Lake Bible Conference attracted several major celebrities of what became known as the fundamentalist movement. In August 1915, William Jennings Bryan, the orator, lawyer, and thrice presidential candidate, delivered the keynote address to the attendees of that summer's conference. Bryan was not just a proponent of fundamentalism. He was the Bible Conference's new president. And in 10 years, he would be the prosecutor in the infamous Tennessee Scopes trial, which battled over whether evolution should be taught in the classroom. Over 20,000 people had arrived that weekend to hear Bryan's message. The speaker preceding him was an evangelist named Bob Jones Sr. As Jones Sr. returned to his seat after preaching his revival sermon, Brian would gently place a hand on the evangelist's knee and lament, "Mr. Jones, if they do not quit teaching evolution as a fact in the schools and colleges of America, we are going to raise a nation of atheists." Brian's remark would appear in a sermon Jones Sr. preached in 1927. Titled "The Perils of America," Jones Sr.'s sermon denounced the modernist scourge he saw sweeping across higher education. He raged against everything from collegiate sports and evolutionary science to co-ed clubs like the Society of Damned Souls. He told terrifying stories of godly teenagers whose Bible-loving parents dutifully sent them to college only to have them leave the faith. One young woman, deep in the thralls of modernist thinking, returned from college in despair, and despite her parents' appeals, shot herself. Jones Sr. blazed, "I had just about as lief send a child to school in hell as put him in one of those institutions." For Jones Sr., the drift of the youth intimated the drift of the nation. Now, throughout his sermon, Jones Sr. tellingly refers to himself as a college president. His eponymous institution, Bob Jones College, had not even matriculated its inaugural class, but Jones Sr. was already touting it as a haven for godly families. The school, however, would not simply teach the Bible. Jones Sr. wanted to push back against the belief that those who practice the old-time religion, as he so fondly called it, were simply cultural buffoons. Jones Sr. had good reasons for his suspicions. The outcome of the Scopes trial, now 2 years past, was clearly on his mind. While Brian had won the verdict, victory proved hollow. On one especially hot July day, the judge had moved the proceedings outside, and Brian took the stand. He was interrogated by attorney Clarence Darrow about the scientific process behind evolution. A sweating, elderly Brian bumbled through his response, which was recorded by over 100 newspapers. Less than 1 week after the trial's conclusion, he died of a massive stroke. After his death, the essayist and reporter H.L. Mencken would deride Brian and his fellow fundamentalists as citizens of a cultural backwater. He seemed, Mencken scoffed, only like a poor clod, like those around him, deluded by a childish theology, full of almost a pathological hatred of all learning, all human dignity, all fine and noble things. Imagine a gentleman, and you have imagined everything he was not. The moment clearly touched a nerve for Jones Sr. He knew that the Scopes trial had pushed fundamentalists even farther from the margins of mainstream American society, and he thus envisioned an institution that would graduate students who were biblically and culturally astute. Perhaps thinking of Mencken, Jones Sr. would claim, Jesus was a gentleman everywhere he went, and Bob Jones' students would be the same. To make his vision a reality, Jones Sr.'s institution embraced forms of highbrow culture. The university required all students to participate in what was known as the cultural program, a regular schedule of musical and dramatic arts focused on the Christian message. In 1929, only 2 years after its founding, the school performed The Merchant of Venice, which people get shocked when I say that, but at the time it was the most frequently performed play after Hamlet. The production notes justified the performance by claiming that Shakespearean drama is of great cultural value and essential to a broad and finished education. 2 years later, Jones Sr. created the Classic Players, which, according to an in-house biography, was the only college-based repertory group in the country. In short, Jones Sr. was using the arts as a way to reclaim cultural legitimacy for fundamentalists. He wanted the school to be, in his words, a continuous Chautauqua. But within the fundamentalist fold, all was not well. The school's theater program was met with early and significant blowback from some faculty. In a chapel talk, Jones Sr. recalled one such incident. She walked around and said, I'm so concerned. They have drama at Bob Jones College, and I think we should have a prayer meeting. She had a right to have it in for old William if she wanted to. That's her privilege. You don't have to love Shakespeare. But she knew Bob Jones College loved Bill Shakespeare. and that faculty member was fired. Fellow fundamentalists, however, were also appalled. In 1940, Oliver Buswell, former president of Wheaton College, wrote a scathing review of a sermon by Jones Sr., fulminating, "Your own educational program is reeking with theatricals and grand opera, which leads young people, as far as I know, and as you ought to know, into a worldly life of sin." The ensuing fallout would remain unreconciled for decades, with Wheaton prohibiting dramatic productions until the 1960s. Despite, and likely because of this resistance, Jones Sr. insisted that the fine arts could be used for the glory of God and the legitimacy of the fundamentalist project. At a 1947 chapel talk, he remarked, "This college was founded to neutralize in this country the idea that if you are a conservative and believe in the Bible, that you are a sort of fanatic or you're lopsided or something. Some people, worldly, highbrowed, snooty people, think if you're a Christian that you are queer. So we wanted to build a college that would neutralize in the minds of the public that culture does not go hand in hand with the old-time conservative Christian approach. And so we started off on that basis." In other words, Bob Jones' students would not simply be aspirants to cultural respectability, but evangelists of it. When he gave this talk, the university was 20 years old, and Jones Sr. was looking toward the future. In this case, it lay in the hands of his son, Bob Jones Jr., who assumed the mantle of the presidency that same year. Bob Jones Jr. would do more than any other president of Bob Jones University, and perhaps any other fundamentalist, to deploy the fine arts in service to the fundamentalist cause. A deep devotee of Shakespeare, Jones Jr. once remarked that his affection for Shakespeare was only second to his love for the Bible. After graduating from the college in 1931, Jones Jr. did postgraduate work at Northwestern University. He then joined the faculty of Bob Jones College and assumed the leadership of the classic players. While at the college, he created a one-man Shakespearean production titled Curtain Calls that he frequently took on tour. Accompanied by classical music, Jones Jr. enacted excerpts from 7 or 8 major Shakespearean roles, including Othello, King Lear, Shylock, and Hamlet. In 1935, Jones Jr. performed his show at the Shakespeare Association of America, which is the annual gathering of American Shakespearean scholars, and still is. The performance was well received. Samuel Tenenbaum, then secretary, reported that Jones Jr., young and handsome, had entertained the audience with brilliant interpretations in costume. He charmed all with his person, his presence, his makeup, his interpretation, and his diction. Jones Jr.'s performances were so well renowned that in 1937, MGM Studios contacted him about conducting a screen test for Shakespearean movies. But he refused. Instead, he wanted to use his talents to advance the fundamentalist institution he would soon helm. Under Jones Jr.'s leadership, the school embraced its identity as a fundamentalist haven for the arts. It adopted the motto, "the world's most unusual university," and expanded its cultural opportunities. In 1947, it began an opera association, a visiting artist series, and an art museum, which still houses one of the largest collections of religious art in the Western Hemisphere. It's a different book. In 1950, it established Unusual Films, one of the first cinematic production studios on a college campus, following only USC and UCLA. And here's the paradox, right? Because anybody here familiar with fundamentalist Protestantism would think the Joneses should reject something like film. But when they embraced film, it was for the same reasons that they first embraced the arts. As Jones Jr. observed, their primary audience for these films was what he called the cultural up and outers. Unusual Films was headed by Catherine Stenholm, a Bob Jones graduate who cut short her doctoral studies at Northwestern to attend summer film school at USC. Stenholm called directing her ministry, and she envisioned a studio that would, in her words, create, quote, Christian and educational films that were spiritually uplifting and technically outstanding. And some of the early films were. One of them was even featured in the student division of the Cannes Film Festival. In 1951, Unusual Films released its first production, Macbeth, with Bob Jones Jr. at the lead. Macbeth was filmed on campus and in the surrounding area, and most of its cast were ministerial students. I did a little snooping and found out that Macduff and King Duncan both went on to be Baptist ministers. The film followed on the heels of Orson Welles' 1948 black and white production of Macbeth. Stenholm's film shares several elements with Welles. Both are deeply, deeply interested in the play's Christian overtones. However, the two films approach Christianity quite differently. While Welles's film interprets the play as a supernatural battle between good and evil, Stenholm's is a study in human depravity. Now, I want to look at this interpretation by watching a few moments from the film. Okay, so for those of you who haven't brushed up on your Shakespearean tragedy, no problem. Here are the cliff notes. Macbeth is a general in 11th century Scotland who receives a prophecy from 3 witches, known as the Weird Sisters, that he will become king. In response to the prophecy, Macbeth and his wife decide, rather than waiting out the death of the current king, Duncan, that they will murder him instead. My students are always like, they couldn't wait. I mean, he was old, right? Coincidentally, Duncan shows up that very evening for a visit. I bet you can guess what happens next. After Duncan's murder and the Macbeth's ascent to the throne, they become increasingly paranoid, worried that they will be unable to hang on to their power. Macbeth goes on a homicidal spree, murdering other nobles until the country lapses into civil war. Lady Macbeth, increasingly haunted by her participation in regicide, descends into madness and eventually commits suicide. In the end, Macbeth dies by the hand of Macduff, a Scottish noble whose family he has murdered. So the first scene I want to show here is the moment when Lady Macbeth greets King Duncan when he enters the Macbeth's castle.
Duncan under my battle. Come, thick night, and pall thee in the dunnest smoke of hell, that my keen knife see not her wounded peaks, nor heaven peep through the blanket of the dark to cry, hold, hold.
All of the follows us.
A couple things here that I just want to say. This film, I've only found one review of it, but the review praised the film for its technicolor. And you can see it's very vivid. And it's also a very short film, only 75 minutes. So let's look at some of the choices here. I think the film makes some pretty innovative choices. In the speech, or in the text, Lady Macbeth's speech is a soliloquy that happens after a messenger announces to her that Duncan is on his way for a surprise visit. Stenholm, however, chooses to make the moment a voiceover, broadcasting Lady Macbeth's treasonous thoughts to the audience. But she also makes several cuts to the speech. As you can see in the production, Lady Macbeth never invokes spirits to unsex her and fill her with direst cruelty. She never calls on the murdering ministers to come to her breasts and take their milk for gall. We only hear a call for thick night. These cuts are common throughout the film. In fact, when compared to Welles's production, Stenholm's Scotland appears downright disenchanted. While Welles's opens his film with the Weird Sisters crafting a voodoo doll of Macbeth, Stenholm's Weird Sisters, played by men, as they were in Shakespeare's day, appear peripheral to the action. We only see them briefly in the opening shots where they utter their prophecies in clipped tones before disappearing. other elements are also diminished. The play doesn't really dwell on the prophecies. Macbeth's fellow general, Banquo, for example, never asks, "Can the devil speak true?" Hecate, the goddess of witchcraft, is completely absent. Now, this is not an uncommon cut, but so are some of the supernatural portents after Duncan's murder, most memorably, the cannibalistic horses. In fact, when Macbeth is asked about his evening, he simply admits to having a, quote, rough night. On the whole, the film seems kind of uninterested in what Macbeth calls supernatural soliciting. So you might ask why Stenholm's film scrubs the very thing that not only inspires the play's tragic action, but also highlights the triumph of Christian values. I have two possible answers. First, all these evocations of witches and demons, even fictional ones, might make some fundamentalist audiences feel uneasy. I mean, let's be honest, we know Jones was appealing to the up and outers, but we know that probably his audience were fundamentalists who were watching it. Evil for many of these audiences is real and personal. And what I think, though, is more likely is that if the film emphasizes what the Apostle Paul calls powers and principalities too much, it actually might diminish the blame that rests on the Macbeth. Wells's film offers a good contrast here. In his film, the witches, like Hecate, claim that they will, quote, draw Macbeth onto his confusion, unquote, and will lead him to false security. Stenholm's film steers a different course. Instead of focusing on the external forces of evil, she examines the internal corrosion of the human soul. Focusing on the effects of sin changes the traditional approach to this play. Many early modern tragedies, Macbeth included, were classified in what's called the De Cassibus tradition, that is, the fall of great men. So think of like King Lear, Othello, even Richard III. But Stenholm's film paints the Macbeths not as figures who necessarily rise and fall, but ones whose decision to choose vice rather than virtue leads to their downfall. In fact, the only review of the film, the one that praised it, also noted that it seemed like, quote, a kind of morality play, unquote. This is true for Macbeth. At the film's opening, he seems like a decisive villain. He never hesitates to commit regicide. And in fact, only 3 minutes after concluding Duncan's murder scene, he's already on the throne plotting the death of Banquo. As for Banquo, he doesn't even come across as a rival to the throne, because he's also received a prophecy that his heirs will also inherit the throne. He instead is a hapless obstacle to the Macbeth's aspirations. And then there is Lady Macbeth. In the play, Lady Macbeth is just as cunning, perhaps even more so than her husband. In the film, however, she plays the role of a Machiavellian helpmeet. Stenholm eliminates the moment where she needles her husband for being hesitant. Instead, we find her practically begging Macbeth to give her the dagger so that she will plant next to Duncan's guards. And after Banquo's ghost appears to Macbeth at a court banquet, and it, just for those of you who haven't seen it, it only appears to him, she stands by her man, dismissing the nobles and gently taking her husband's hand in a gesture of comfort, blunting any competing motivation within this film. It allows Stenholm to focus on a couple whose shared goal is vice. And then it revels in that couple's downfall. For Lady Macbeth, the result is madness. Like the play, the film depicts her sleepwalking while she haphazardly confesses her guilt. In Stenholm's production, she haltingly descends a stairwell wearing a dun-colored nightgown, her hair uncovered. The nightgown, plain and unembellished, emblematizes the self she wishes to hide. Following a famous 19th century performance, Lady Macbeth stops halfway down the stairs and sets down her light, which in the film is a biblical oil lamp rather than a taper, small detail, and tries to scrub the blood from her hands. Her face contorts, and she emits a long, slow groan while palace servants look on in horror. One of them succinctly remarks, "I would not have such a heart in my bosom for the dignity of the whole body." As for Macbeth, the film is rather heavy-handed with his undoing. Buckling under the weight of sin, Macbeth becomes consumed by anxiety, pulling at his collar and touching his face. By the film's conclusion, though, he seems almost deadened to his actions. When he hears of Lady Macbeth's suicide, he gazes out from the castle rampart and somewhat spiritlessly recites the tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow monologue. A soldier looks on in strained sympathy. I want to now look at the final scene from the film that shows Macbeth's downfall. I'm going to play, it's just about 3 minutes, and you get battle scenes too, which I enjoy. Okay, you get that picture. So as you can see, the film's final message is pretty clear. Outside of brief battle scenes, which I actually thought were pretty well done for a university film department, we see the final confrontation. Okay. It was early in university film departments. We see the final confrontation between Macbeth and Macduff. So when he sees Macduff, Macbeth repeats one of the prophecies, essentially saying, "You can't harm me. I can't be killed by one of woman born." And Macduff responds, "Joke's on you, buddy. I was born by C-section." So the two fight, but the actual sword play lasts only 12 seconds. But from there, the movie swerves pretty significantly from Shakespeare. The play concludes with a speech given by Malcolm, who is Duncan's son who fled to England. Malcolm announces that there's going to be a new political order, and then he denounces the Macbeth's tyrannical reign before welcoming back those who fled Scotland. The speech doubles as an epilogue, and for that reason, it's often cut in length or even altogether from programs. But it does serve to refocus the play's political themes and broadcast the restoration of order. Stenholm's approach turns outward. As you saw, she overlays Luke 8:35 upon the image of Macbeth's severed head. What shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? The verse, of course, speaks to what the play calls Macbeth's vaulting ambition, but it also highlights the film's central message, that the Macbeths engaged in a fatal trade-off between worldly and spiritual gain. And this gets me to Stenholm's point. Rather than focusing on the political or supernatural consequences of the Macbeth's reign of terror, her film highlights the terror found in their own souls. In many ways, I think this film is like a good revivalist sermon. After vividly displaying the horrible effects of sin, it then turns outward toward its audience. And with that verse, it asks them to consider their own response of what would happen should they be lured by worldly ambition. Stenholm's focus on the Macbeth's personal culpability, bolstered by an overt biblicism, should be familiar to us by now. It follows a line of interpretation that we've seen in McGuffey, Colton, and Vincent, and it was of course true for the Joneses, who believed that Shakespeare's plays offered a perspicuous moral vision. And this leads me back to Shylock. I want to conclude by briefly considering why this painting hangs in the university administration building, although I'm pretty sure it's gone. Jones Jr., after all, was not painted as Macbeth or Hamlet or Richard III. He chose to be painted as Shylock. And I believe in many ways his interest in Shylock aligns with his beliefs about the way Shakespeare displays his moral vision. As you'll recall, Jones Jr. played Shylock in the school's first production. He would go on to play Shylock 9 more times. In 1988, Unusual Films released Shakespeare and Shylock, 50 Years of Classical Acting, an interview where Jones Jr. discussed his interest in Shylock and Shakespeare more generally. Jones Jr. here claimed that Shylock is interesting, quote, because he's very simple. He's not complex, and yet he comes across as very complex. Like Stenholm's Macbeth, Jones Jr.'s focus is on Shylock's moral culpability as a character, and he would use that interpretation for evangelistic purposes. The year after Macbeth was produced, Jones Jr. would go on to make a film called Pound of Flesh, and I'm currently in talks to get a digital copy of this film. In it, he appears as a minister, preaching on humanity's need for grace, that people cannot earn their salvation, but are in need of God's mercy. This is classic Protestant stuff. But then, to illustrate his point, Jones Jr. leaves the pulpit only to reemerge through a set of open doors as Shylock. His point is to show the outcome of those who only want justice rather than mercy. For Jones Jr., Shylock, in other words, is another character in a Shakespeare morality play. He is the one who chooses the law over grace and is, in Jones Jr.'s words, thus inevitably lost. The Joneses' approach to Shakespeare's plays as images of moral certitude is not surprising. Fundamentalism, after all, long opposed what it called moral relativism. But Jones Jr. would go further. In his memoir, appropriately titled Cornbread and Caviar, he called Shakespeare the most moral of playwrights, and I had the quote up earlier, whose spiritual vision and understanding never permit him to make vice attractive. This insistence that Shakespeare could offer audiences a, quote, spiritual vision and understanding, quote, unquote, seems to clash with fundamentalism's bibliocentrism. But the Joneses were unusual. They believed the fine arts could legitimize the fundamentalist project, even becoming a catalyst for evangelization. In short, they enthusiastically embraced the belief that they were the world's most unusual university. In blending sermons with stagecraft, they sought a way to enter through that narrow gate separating the secular from the sacred. And they did it with Shakespeare on their tongues. Thank you. Yeah, sure. Sure, yeah. Do you want me?
No, Jillian's going to, we have time for discussion and questions, and I'll let her do the leading.
Okay. Yes.
So there's that last little indication about Shylock representing law or grace over law, et cetera, et cetera. Can you talk about a little bit about if there was other, I mean, that's a pretty like literal reading of the kind of the anti-Judaism of Merchant. So I'm curious about how that links up with other parts of Bob Jones University platform, understanding of like how certain representations can contribute to that understanding of overcoming law, overcoming sort of the Jewish backwardness
Right.
Yeah.
So
And it's kind of ironic, of course, because they're infleshing the overcoming of the flesh, as it were. Yeah.
right. And so this gets to like the paragraph that I was like, how do we talk about anti-Semitism at Bob Jones University? I have looked into kind of like what is going on here, and within the Shakespeare and Shylock film, Jones Jr. is asked point blank, "Is this an anti-Semitic play?" And he goes, "No, it's not. It's not an anti-Semitic play. It's silly to think that it's an anti-Semitic play." And I have the quote here. He says, "Shylock is not an object of hatred because he's a Jew, but because he's a kind of a nasty man." But yeah, I know. But then he wavers, and the interview gets really interesting. He says that actually Venice is a nasty place. So there's like this entire like environment of nastiness that is happening. And then he says something else, and this was where I just kept pausing and saying, did he really say this? "The Jew has been so mistreated that your sympathy in that sense goes out to him. He is what the Gentiles have made him." Now, to me, that sounds like anti-Semitism, right? Like, you keep, saying things about people, you keep hurting people, and they're going to react, right? And so it strikes me that he's trying to do both and. He does in the film condemn early sort of representations of Shylock in a red wig and with a large nose. You can see in the representations here, he's actually hearkening back to a Victorian representation. And so he's trying to get rid of those sort of clown images. But yeah, I mean, he's still embedded in this view, right, of basically Shylock as other and somebody who cannot ever enter the fold. Yes?
I have a question about another character in The Merchant of Venice, Portia, because it seems like the other relevance of this play is that Portia is this character that kind of stages the virtue of trickery and of performance. So I was wondering how she is depicted in this performance, if you've seen it or if you know how she's...
I haven't seen Portia yet, and I am very interested in this, right? Because obviously he is talking... he's citing Portia's speech, right? I mean, and so the very fact that he is appearing as Shylock and we don't see Portia, I'm curious myself to find out what this is going to look like. I'm very excited to see this film. Mm-hmm.
So Pound of Flesh is actually a full version of the Merchant of Venice performance?
It's not a full version. So what it does is it actually contains scenes from The Merchant of Venice that he kind of interposes with this sermon. The only way I was able to kind of know that it existed was he mentions it in this 1988 interview, and then I went back to look at the Bob Jones yearbooks and saw shots from the movie. So all I have is a quick description of what happens in the film by Jones Jr. and then the images from the yearbook to kind of work with to figure out what was going on. Yes?
You mentioned Charles Laporte's book, Bardology, and I think most of his subject matters are British, and you're interestingly talking like a broader Anglo-American Protestant. But I'm wondering, at this stage, have you thought about the American version of Bardology versus the British, and particularly when you get to institutions like Oxford and Cambridge that have confessional identities. Melville mentions the 39 Articles.
Right.
Makes me think of Arnold's claim.
Right.
What are the 39 Articles to Shakespeare? And he says that way in 1880. So since America doesn't have an established church and doesn't have analogous institutions like Oxford and Cambridge, do you want to generalize about the different stories?
Yeah, I think that's why I looked at Chautauqua, because that is one of the most trans-denominational sort of institutions in the United States. And it's one in which, I mean, H.L. Mencken actually derides Chautauqua. He calls it the sort of lower reaches of the arts. But I think Chautauqua in institutions like this that are basically in some ways grassroots, are the places where you need to kind of figure out how people are working with Shakespeare. And so because they're, I do realize putting like Buswell and Emerson and Melville out there, I'm looking from the sort of literati, right? Rather than from folks that are on the ground. But this is a part of the project that I'm still just starting to flesh out. And the Simons and the Colton were the sort of two first forays into that. So I'm sorry I can't give you a better answer. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Just wondering if you have the script for the Bob Jones Merchant of Venice by any chance. I'm just wondering if the same kind of attempt to reduce female agency that you tracked in the Macbeth operates in the Merchant of Venice. There are traditions of producing the play without the fifth act. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering if...
I don't have the script yet. So my plan is to go to Greenville next year for their 100th anniversary and see their Shakespeare production, whatever they're going to put on. Maybe it'll be Merchant. But they, what I do know is they actually destroyed several documents in their archives in 2021. So I don't even know if they still have it. I know. So this is like one of those things where it's like, I hope it's there when I get there. Yeah. You had a question.
Yeah, I was just curious. So if Shakespeare is the opening to this attempt to be cultured and fundamentalist at the same time, are there other artists that door opens to, or is it just Shakespeare? I mean, I'm guessing you're not performing Beckett. What are they? Where does the limit go, and who else makes the stage for Bob Jones?
So my focus has largely been on Shakespeare. As I've kind of perused the yearbooks, I've seen Moliere, which is surprising, right? I've seen Cyrano de Bergerac. I've seen Wagner in their opera association, and Verdi. But from that answer, I have to kind of look. I also look at their homeschool curriculum, and basically once you get to the modern era, they kind of cut it. Yeah, really, the one member of a former member of the university describes it this way: the arts are Victorian, so they're kind of hearkening back to a very sort of specific era of what they believe high art is. Beckett's probably not a part of that. So. Mm-hmm.
Maybe following up on that, I was thinking of resonances between what you're describing here and the way that the Metamorphoses functioned in the early modern period as like the canonical literary text. Mm-hmm. Like preachers would like look at the Bible and the Metamorphoses, like Arthur Golding translated Calvin into English, translated the Metamorphoses and said Christians ought to take this seriously as like revealing Christian truth. So like, and similarly, like maybe because it was quite old, like it wasn't a modern text, but what is it about this kind of like selective canon of literature that's useful as an appendage to biblical texts?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are several answers to that question. One has to do with the sort of spread of British culture and of the British Empire. That's one way to answer that question. I think there's another way to answer that question, and that really has to do with the way that the Metamorphoses are viewed. Like you go back to this like sort of Greco-Roman era, right? Ad fontes. You go back to the sources to kind of think through the world now. And in one edition of their homeschool materials, they say this. They say Shakespeare represented a world in which the Bible was at the pinnacle of civilization. And so really works from the early modern era for them are, besides the dirty ones, although Shakespeare's dirty, and I didn't get to talk about this, but Jones Jr. has an entire sort of like, well, he might be bawdy, but he's never obscene. And I'm like, well, maybe you're not reading the same play as I'm reading. But really, there is this sense in which, because Shakespeare is in this golden age of the Bible, he really represents what a biblical worldview could produce. So, yeah.
I was also thinking about it from like a Catholic perspective, like as arguments, he's closet Catholic, like I'm not invested in any of those at all necessarily, but like, what then makes him particularly Protestant for these readers, right? And not just generally biblical, right?
Right.
Just because he was writing after the Reformation?
I don't think so. I think the Joneses just assume that he's Protestant, and in the sort of homeschool editions, they make like longer arguments about the Protestant world. But other publishers, religious publishers, do take up this question. So there is another conservative Protestant publisher of Shakespeare called Abeka out of Pensacola College. It's another fundamentalist institution in Pensacola, Florida. And in Abeka's edition, they actually cite Shakespeare's will at the end and say, well, that's the reason he's Protestant. And in another element I couldn't include in this, in the 21st century, the first few decades, a conservative Catholic publisher named Ignatius Press put out several editions of Shakespeare, and their editor believes not only was Shakespeare a recusant secret Catholic, but that he wrote his plays as a sort of battle against the secular forces of the Stuart monarchy to kind of instruct Catholics. The editor was living in Greenville for a time and actually went to the university to solicit essays from the faculty on Bob Jones's English department. And they just laughed. Like, they kind of smiled at him and they're like, "You're a Jesuit publisher. Do you think we're going to like have anything to do with you?" And he was like, "I just can't." He wrote in his blog and he was like, "I just can't understand why they didn't want to fight a common enemy with me." And I was like, "Well, I have a couple reasons." So I actually wrote an article to kind of explain it to him. I wanted to just like gently help him work through the argument. So yes.
Any evidence that the Joneses ever touched The Tempest?
Oh, yes. The Tempest was produced at least in 1950. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Tell us more about the depiction of Caliban there, and I'm thinking about it in relationship to the fraught nexus
Right.
of race, ethnicity, and religion, animating this very problematic depiction of Shylock, and together with the thing you mentioned in passing early in your talk, which is the deep resistance into the 80s of interracial dating at this university. So I'd love to just hear just any kind of factual information about Caliban, but also your reflections on how you see that as maybe a window into the kind of fraught place of race in this retrieval of Shakespeare.
That's a great question. I haven't had a chance to really dig into their depictions of the Tempest, if only because the material is just a couple shots from the yearbook, right? And so I want to be thoughtful in kind of the archive that I'm working with to not take too much out from just a few yearbook photos. And so I have to work with kind of what's available to me. Yeah. Yes, in the back.
I had a question kind of about the networks of distribution of these films. So you said that there's a particular audience that unusual films wanted to reach, but it seems probably more probable that they were being viewed by other companies. So who was like running these films? Were they actually shown ever in any kind of mainstream film venues, or are they being sent off to other Christian colleges? Like, how was it getting out into the world?
Yeah, so the early films, which were Sheffy and I think it was like Light of the Dawn or something. That was actually, Light of the Dawn was the one entered in the Cannes Film Festival. And so I think in those early years, especially in the early 50s, there was a sense in which they were going to break in to sort of mainstream distribution lines. But what happens in the late 50s is Billy Graham attends Bob Jones University for a few years, and he and the Joneses start to beef pretty badly. And they make a concerted step back from Graham's evangelistic outreach, especially because it reaches across faith lines into Catholicism. And so I think that is the moment when the Joneses kind of start to turn insular, and the films only then are marketed toward churches, private Christian schools, which crop up as a result of racial segregation, and then sort of private home viewing. Yeah.
All right, before we express our appreciation to Jillian, just to invite you to a light reception outside to continue continue conversation in person. But let us express our appreciation.
Thank you.